1.
Hi there. This is The Bite Show. I'm Olaf Hage. Georgia Ann is under the weather, and I have a special report for you about comets and prophecy. As you may be aware, there is a comet in the sky right now, a comet you can see. It's in the sign of Perseus. Perseus has a sword in his hand, the right hand held over his head, and in his left hand he holds the head of the Medusa. The Medusa is one of the three heads of the Gorgon, which was a three-headed monster. Now, the Gorgon was a very ancient symbol of pagan origin, but it's obvious that there is a three-headed monster in the book of Revelation, if you think about it, in the sense that there is the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. So we have this idea of three evil beings who are somehow related to one another. And Perseus cuts the head of the one which is considered the mortal head of the Gorgon off, and thereby kills the Gorgon. And this mortal head is said to be the Medusa, meaning that it's a female, or at least that's the suggestion. But the stars in the Medusa's head are quite interesting. For example, the one of the forehead, which is the brightest star of the Medusa's head in Perseus's hand, his left hand, is called Algol. No, it's not a star that got the Nobel Peace Prize. It means the ghoul in Arabic. A-L-G-O-L actually means the ghoul. Now, that doesn't, of course, sound very feminine. And one of the two eyes of the Medusa is called Hage.Typhon, which means the head of Satan. And there, I think we see who this really is. So the symbolism of the names kind of reveals who we're talking about. I should point out that a lot of the Arabic names that you see for these stars, they're not Muslim names. They go back to a pre-Islamic era, back to when the Arabic world was still Christian. And so the names often have a Christian symbolism. So it's not surprising at all to find the head of the Medusa labeled with a star called Hage.Typhon, or the head of Satan. Well, this, of course, is not the only naked-eye comet that we have seen recently in the skies. Hage.Typhon came by in 1996, and the comet Hale-Bopp came by in 1997. And that was just barely a little over 10 years ago. Now, there was another naked-eye comet just a year ago, Comet McNaught. So we've actually had 4 naked-eye comets in about 11 years. Now, that is extraordinarily unusual. I've studied astronomy, believe it or not, for about 50 years. And, yeah, I know that sounds odd, but I'm 62 and I started when I was 12. So I've been looking at the stars for about exactly 50 years. And the interesting thing is, in fact, I think it's 50 years this Christmas to be really precise. So we're almost exactly on the money there for 50 years. And in all that time, I've looked for comets in the sky. I've tried to observe when they would come by. And I can only think of 2 or 3 comets that were naked-eye comets in my whole life until 1996, and then we started to see them coming by almost on a regular basis. It was like buses, you know, if you miss one, another one will be along in a few minutes. This is a very unusual cluster of visible comets. And the first one was in 1996. We need to go back. My wife was still alive at the time, and I remember that I had to sneak out of the house because I didn't want to disturb her, and to look at this comet. And it was about midnight, and I went outside and I looked up to see if I could find the comet. Boy, was I in for a shock. Comet Hage.Typhon covered the entire visible sky. Now, I have to explain what I mean by visible, because I'm talking about visible to me. What I mean is that we have a set of condos here, and then there's a row of trees where the woods are, and of course between the woods and the condos there's a road. And so there's a kind of a narrow strip of sky overhead that I could easily see. And so as I looked up, as I stepped out the front of the condo and I looked up to the sky, everything I could see overhead was filled with comet Hage.Typhon. The comet was off, that is, the head of the comet was off to the left, and the tail stretched all the way over the road down to the entrance to the condos. It was really amazing to see. I suppose that the narrow field of view that I had made it seem larger than it really was. Sort of the same phenomena you get when you see a full moon on the horizon and it looks huge, but when it's overhead it doesn't look so big. It really is the same size at both locations. But when you see the moon down near the horizon with the trees around it, it just kind of seems to be larger. Well, this had kind of the same effect for me. When I stretched my arms out, you know how they say hold a quarter at arm's length to see how it stacks up versus the size of the object that you're looking at, or a dime? Well, you can't do that with what I was looking at. I had to literally spread my arms apart to encompass the length of that comet from the tip of my left hand to the tip of my right hand. It stretched across the sky before me. It was the most spectacular, by far, astronomical object that I had ever seen in my life. And I had spent, at that point, 40 years in observing the skies, and I had never seen anything like this before. And to be honest, I haven't seen anything like it since. The naked-eye comets that we've seen since Comet Hage-Typhon have not been anywhere near as spectacular as that. Hale-Bopp came by the following year, and it was, well, I would say about the size of a pea at arm's length. I mean, it was tiny. You just imagine a big green pea, or what would I say there, maybe a very large BB or something. It wasn't very large at all, just big enough so that you could tell that it was a comet. But on the other hand, through a pair of binoculars, it got a little bigger. It was a larger comet in actual size. The estimates I recall were that Hale-Bopp was about 25 miles in diameter, whereas Hage-Typhon was only about a mile in diameter. However, Hage-Typhon came right over the Earth. Hale-Bopp never got any closer to the Earth than, I think, the Sun. I mean, it was just at least 100 million miles away, I think, at its closest approach, somewhere along those lines. It was way out there. So even though it was 25 times wider, and I think it's the square, I'm going to guess here, that's about 600 times brighter, it was so much further away that it wasn't very impressive at all. Well, Comet McNaught last year wasn't a very impressive object, but it did went by the sun in a very spectacular way, and a lot was made of it, came by in December, and when it came by, it went through the sign of Scorpio into the sign of Sagittarius, and was, I think, in the stinger of Scorpio at one point. It also crossed through at the entrance to Scorpio, which was the mouth of the Scorpion. And at the mouth of the Scorpion is a very peculiar star that back around 1998, 1999 started to flare up and became a variable star. And that star in the mouth of the Scorpion, or the jaws of death as it sometimes is called, also it could have been the forehead of the Scorpion, depending on how you look at it. But that star is 407 light years away. Now, it's an interesting variable star, and when Comet McNaught passed by there, it was passing a star that had just started flaring up just shortly after comets Hage-Typhon and Hale-Bopp had gone by. Now, they didn't go by that spot, however. They went by a different spot. They went through Perseus. They went through the same place that Comet Holmes is going through at the moment. And that seems rather coincidental, because we've got 3 of these 4 comets going through Perseus, and one of them going through the head of Scorpio. Well, Scorpio is a sign that represents death, the jaws of death, as Paul calls it in the New Testament, and it's a very interesting spot. The entrance to Scorpio, which is the cusp with Libra, where the jaws of death are located, is where this star that's 407 light years away started to flicker and change its brightness very dramatically. 407 light years. You know, that's not just any number, because in the book of Genesis, where it talks about the mark that God put on Cain's forehead, at least that's where people assume it is, it probably was the likely location, that word mark in Hebrew is spelled Aleph, Vav, Tav. And the numerical value of those 3 letters for the word mark, which is what God put on his forehead, it says he put Aleph, Vav, Tav on his forehead. Everybody says, well, what was the mark? But the way the Hebrew reads is that that's what he put on his forehead, Aleph, Vav, Tav. In other words, the 3 Hebrew letters that add up in value to 407. So what God actually did was he wrote the number 407 on Cain's forehead. Now, that's not the only way to interpret it, of course, but it is certainly one way to interpret it. And certainly the rabbis recognized that that was a legitimate interpretation. So we had Comet Magnot going through the forehead of, if you will, the scorpion, through his jaws, past this star that had the numerical value of the mark, that is 407, on the forehead of Cain. Very interesting. Well, Comet Hage.Typhon on April 11th of 1996 passed through the side of Perseus, but it actually crossed over a specific spot in Perseus. It crossed through the Medusa's head. And not just any spot on the head, it actually crossed over the star Hage.Typhon, the head of Satan. Gee, now that's starting to be a little creepy. Well, guess what? On the exact same day, April 11th, 1 year later, 1997, Comet Hale-Bopp came by in a different direction and crossed the exact same star, Hage.Typhon, the head of Satan. So we had 2 comets crossing the head of Satan in the Medusa, and we have 1 comet going through the jaws of death and crossing a star that is 407 light years away, which happens to be the number of the mark on Cain's forehead. Getting to be a little beyond the possibility of coincidence here, isn't it? Well, guess what's about to happen? Hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen on January 22nd, 2008. The comet that is currently naked eye visible in the sky, Comet Holmes, is going to cross through the head of the Medusa. But it isn't going to cross through Hage.Typhon, which is the eye of the Medusa. It's going to cross through the brightest star in the head of the Medusa. It is going to cross through Algol itself, the ghoul, that forehead spot. You know, the place where presumably the mark of Cain was written. It's going to cross that spot on January 22nd, 2008. Now, it's interesting to watch what Comet Holmes has been doing in the sky. It started out, well, I don't know exactly where it started out, because these things sort of get spotted and then people say, oh, look, there it is. But it was in the head of, let's see here, it was in the head of Aries the Lamb, which is associated with the Passover. and of course that's the time when Jesus was crucified. Aries the Lamb, it was there in December of 2006. So now think about this, as Comet McNaught was going through Scorpio, Comet Holmes was coming out of the head of the Lamb, presumably, if you want to use the biblical symbolism here, of the Lamb of God, Aries the Lamb, symbolizing the Passover, of course, the time of the year when Passover would occur, at least in the time of Jesus. So we're looking at a symbol here that certainly sounds like it might have something to do with Jesus. And it goes up and it circles the belly button or the left hand, depending on what you want to do with it here, because the left hand of Perseus is kind of over his belly button. It circles that part of his body, and as it does so, it arcs through his chest area and comes down on the top of the head of the Medusa, hits Algol, the ghoul, and then exits out through his legs toward Auriga, the shepherd. So starts from the lamb, circles, if you will, the solar plexus or the hand that's holding the Medusa by its hair of Perseus, and then goes out to end up in Auriga. That's what Comet Holmes is doing. Now, so far, it's done the following. It's crossed just under the chin of the Medusa and up the side of the head of the Medusa. And it has crossed through the general groin area of Perseus and has come out to his side and arced back in again over his heart through the chest area and then down his left arm onto the head of the Medusa. That's where it's headed at the moment. It hasn't quite reached there. So on October 23rd, as it had just exited through over the thigh of Perseus, it suddenly exploded. It exploded and it just became a big ball of fragments, slowly expanding. Right now, as it's headed toward the head of the Medusa, it has exploded to the extent that it is larger than the sun. It is now the largest object in the entire solar system in terms of its size. Of course, it's very tenuous because it's in an exploded state. And it still hasn't reached the head of the Medusa yet. It still hasn't reached Algol. It still hasn't reached the ghoul. Now, that forehead position where that star is located is obviously very symbolic. Symbolic of the number 407 that was on Cain's forehead, the mark of the beast, this whole idea of Satan's mark or the mark of the Antichrist and so forth. These symbols are all here, and just remember, we've already had two comets X across the head of Satan's star in the Medusa's head, and now we're going to hit the forehead of the Medusa head-on January 22nd. Plus, we had Comet McNaught symbolically doing the same thing in the sign of Scorpio. Now, for there to be four naked-eye comets in such a short period of time is extraordinary. For them to all carry this symbolism and to go, three of them at least, three of the four, to go through the head of the Medusa is absolutely beyond the realm of chance. This is not a chance occurrence. What is happening here is clearly supposed to warn us about something. This is an omen. If you believe in God at all, if you believe that there is a God who orchestrates the heavens, who created them and stretched forth the heavens like a curtain, as the Scripture says, then it would seem to me you would have to conclude that these comets are not coming by randomly, that there is a meaning to all of this. That meaning was determined thousands of years ago. According to Jewish tradition, and early Christian tradition as well, by the way, the stars were named by Seth, the son of Adam. And so these names originally were given in a very ancient time, thousands and thousands of years ago. Now we have something happening that depends on those names that were given to those objects thousands of years ago. Think about what that means for us right this minute. We are the net prophetic beneficiaries of something that was done, words that were spoken to Seth, the son of Adam, according to tradition, thousands of years ago. That should make you quake in your boots. Something is happening right now, visible with your eyes in the sky, overhead, that is part of a prophetic fulfillment that has been thousands of years in the making. What does it mean? Well, let's take a look at the symbols. We have something that comes out of the lamb and goes into the shepherd. It circles the hand that's holding the head of the Medusa. This hand is over the belly button or solar plexus. You just kind of imagine putting your left hand over your belly button and you get a pretty good idea of where it's located in the side of Perseus. And this spot is the middle or the center of that circle that the comet makes as it goes around Perseus and hits the top of the Medusa just as it's about completing its loop. And then it continues on its way into Auriga the shepherd. That symbolism suggests to me that the Lamb of God and the shepherd is Perseus. In other words, it's trying to tell us that these three are connected together. And when it comes down on the head of the Medusa, it is talking about the fulfillment of a prophecy that is way back at the beginning of the book of Genesis, Genesis 3:15. You'll recall there that Eve is being told that there is going to be some kind of rectification for the sin that Adam and Eve committed and their exile from the garden. And God says that the seed of the woman, which is understood to mean a virgin-born son, would crush the head of the serpent, which of course is actually not the head of the serpent, but the head of the serpent's seed, to be precise. And he is going to crush his head. So the seed of the serpent, according to some people, is Cain. That is to say that he is the one who is reckoned to be the son of the evil one. And in fact, if you look at the New Testament to the first epistle of John, you'll notice in there that he calls Cain the son of the evil one. So whether he is or is not literally his son, he is called that. So he is reckoned to be, if you will, the serpent's seed. And therefore the number 407 would seem to apply here, since that is the mark of Cain. And indeed, Comet McNaught tied the number 407 to this by passing through this area of this star that is 407 light years away that suddenly started to flare up after comets Hage.Typhon and Hale-Bopp passed through the heavens. So we have here a symbolism that is clearly indicating some connection among these things. Well, Comet Hage.Typhon came by on April 11th of 1996, crossing Rosh Hashanah on that night. Comet Hale-Bopp on April 11th the following year, exactly 1 year later to the exact same day, crossed Rosh Hashanah in a different direction, a big X over the head of Satan, which clearly goes back to this prophecy in Genesis 3:15 about crushing the head of Satan's seed. So, they clearly were also tied to it. And then here we have this current comet, Comet 17B Holmes, which is going to also, on January 22nd, cross this spot in the forehead of the Medusa. Although it won't be the exact same spot, it's going to cross Algol instead of Rosh Hashanah, although they're very close together. Now, clearly these are all tied together. There shouldn't be any doubt, unless you're a total atheist and think this is the greatest coincidence in the history of the cosmos, and are just going to write it off like that. But if you have any faith at all, this event should, in fact, be drawing a great deal of attention to you. By the way, Comet McNaught had also, in the fall of 2006, gone through something called Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is a sign, it's one of the decans of Scorpio. He is an image of Christ crushing the head of the serpent. That's exactly what it's a picture of. If you have a picture of the heavenly signs of the zodiac that shows the images, go looking for Ophiuchus near Scorpio, and you'll see that that's what it's a picture of. He's got his foot right on the head of a serpent there. Now, this is not an unusual thing for the heavens. A lot of these signs have biblical and Christian symbolism associated with them. But it is very strange when you've got 4 naked-eye comets in such a short period of time that all have something to do with the same exact symbol, the symbol of Christ crushing the head of the serpent. Well, let's take a look at something else. The times that are covered here. On April 11th of 1997, a year after Hage.Typhon had come by, as Comet Hale-Bopp was crossing Rosh Hashanah, the head of Satan, that very night, somebody, mysterious somebody, unknown, called up the cardinal who was in charge of the town of Turin in Italy, and he said that there was about to be a fire that night in the Turin chapel, and that the Shroud of Turin was in danger. And so the cardinal, of course, did what any good cardinal of the Catholic Church would do. He ignored the warning. You see, the Catholic Church isn't terribly fond of the Shroud. It never has been, which is something most people don't realize. Everybody thinks this is a big Catholic relic, but in fact the Catholic Church has tried to dismiss it and write it off ever since it first appeared back about 100 years or more before the time of Leonardo da Vinci. I mentioned that it was before then because some people mistakenly think that maybe Leonardo faked it, but of course that can't be since it was around before Leonardo. But on April 11th of 1997, fire did in fact break out in the Turin chapel. And of course, once it broke out, the firemen went in, not the cardinal, of course, but the firemen went in and rescued the Shroud of Turin. And he brought it out in its silver reliquary. And of course, thinking that this was the thing to do, he brought it to the cardinal's residence. And I think it's a cardinal. It could have been a bishop. I don't really care which he was. But anyway, whoever the prelate was there. And he lays it out. They take it out of there. They want to make sure it's safe, you see. So they take it out of the reliquary, and they laid it out on the dining room table. Now, that's amazing. Because, they went to so much trouble when the scientists were examining it to make sure nothing was wrong with it, make sure it was okay, dating it and experimenting with it and so forth, and they wanted to make sure they didn't damage it, or hurt it in any way. And now they just, after the fire, they just rolled it out on the dining room table there. And there's a photograph that shows it lying on the dining room table there in the bishop's or cardinal's residence. And you can see all the reporters who've come in and are walking around the table. And you can see several people have their arms outstretched as if they're touching the shroud. And it occurred to me when I saw this photograph that anybody who had sticky fingers, double-faced tape, a little spirit gum or something on the tip of their finger, could touch the shroud and remove DNA. And lo and behold, the very next year, a little over a year later, a group called the Ra Aliens, that's right, the Ra Aliens or Raelians, in Canada announced that they had done the first human cloning. Now, they didn't say where they got the human DNA from, though. They did claim that 18 days after they had successfully cloned a male, they did say it was a male, that they had destroyed the embryo. 18 days. That would be 3 times 6, right? And so supposedly that embryo never became a man. Oddly enough, the time that they announced this was the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus, according to my calculations. I have an article up on my website, thetimequest.com, on the birth date of Jesus, if you want to go look at my arguments for that. The Time Quest is all one word, TheTimequest.com. And there's actually a couple of articles on the chronology of the birth of Jesus up there. But I believe that Jesus was born in September of 3 BC, and in September of 1998, the aliens were doing this cloning of somebody that they would not identify. I don't know if that was a coincidence or not. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Anyway, the following year, we had the Mars expedition where they were photographing the face on Mars. You know, they got a nice close-up, and everybody said, "Oh, it's just a mountain. You know, it's not real." But you know, I've taken a really good look at that image, and I think it looked very artificial. It had very straight sides to it, and even though it doesn't look as much like a face now, it certainly looks very artificial to my eye. Wonder who built that. But in any case, the planet Mars came into the news very prominently that year in 1999, and that was when this star that's 407 light years away started to flare up. And it flared up even brighter in 2000 and 2001 and so forth. And then in 2002, something very strange happened. The Vatican suddenly hired a Protestant Swiss woman to vacuum clean the Shroud of Turin of all of that stuff that was on it. You know, blood and particles of granite from the tomb and the remains of the flowers that have been used to bury the body. You know, that stuff that was so unimportant. Now, she says she saved the bag, you know, the little bag that you get when you vacuum something. She says she saved the bag, so it's nice to know, just in case somebody wants a jumbled version of the evidence that was on the shroud. Not terribly useful in that form. I mean, it's somewhat useful, but it would have been more useful in place, if you follow me. Anyway, she cleaned the shroud in the summer of 2002. And now, in 2006, we have Comet McNaught come by, and in 2007, of course, now we have Comet Holmes. The time frame here is very interesting. If you start from April 11th of 1996 and you add 10 and a half years to that, it comes out in October of 2006. And if you add 10 and a half years to April 11th of 1997, when the Turin Chapel fire occurred, it comes out in October of 2007. So, I think I said that right. One comes out in 2006 and one comes out in 2007. And what's 10 and a half years? Well, it's 3 times 3.5 years, or if you will, 3 times 42 months. In other words, 3 times 1,260 days. 3 times 3.5 years, which of course relates to the book of Revelation, to the time that the beast is going to rule, various things, the time that the 2 witnesses are going to prophesy. A number of time frames given in the book of Revelation are 3.5 years long. And there's 4 of them. Now, 3 of them put together, end to end, so to speak, would give you the time frame from the start of this sequence of comets to the present time, in effect. And October of 2007 marks a very important point here, because remember, that's when this current comet, Comet 17b Holmes, exploded. So the very moment that that comet exploded marked the 10.5-year point from the time that the Turin Chapel fire had occurred. Now, I don't know, I'm not being superstitious here. I just think that this is an omen of something, because I believe that God's in charge of the universe. I don't think that God does sloppy work. And this doesn't look sloppy to me. This looks awfully precise. I think he's telling us something. And what he's telling us has to do with the whole image of the serpent's head being crushed by the seed of the woman. But you'll notice here that the comet, just before it exploded, had passed through the groin area of Perseus. That represents, if you will, the seed of Perseus. Now, if Perseus represents Christ, what is his seed? I believe his seed represents the church, that we are his seed. That is, that the Christian church itself becomes the seed, if you will, of Christ. We are his brothers, if you will, his clones. He lays hands on the apostles, he breathes upon them, and he says, "Receive ye the Holy Spirit." Well, it is his spirit, and notice that the comet goes through the chest area, through the lungs, through the spirit area, if you will, of Perseus, before it hits the head of the Medusa. I think that what is about to occur has something to do with an event that is going to occur at the second coming. I refer you to the book of Revelation, chapter 16. It describes there the second coming of Jesus, or the period of it. It talks about the wrath of God coming to an end. And what is it that brings the wrath of God to an end? It is a hailstorm. Hailstones as big as 100 weight. Now, 100 weight is about the weight of a cannonball. I want you to think of it not as hail falling from the sky. I want you to think of it as a rain of cannonballs falling from the sky. If you've ever seen a heavy hailstorm, and imagine each of those bits of hail, I mean, the heavy hailstorm is like a snow blizzard or a heavy rainstorm. Imagine each one of those weighing a cannonball's weight. Now, that's destructive, and that would crush a lot of heads if it hit them. Well, what would trigger such a storm? According to the book of Revelation, the kingdom of the beast, who at that time rules the whole world, is cast into darkness. That means the entire earth is cast into darkness. That means the sun itself has gone dark. In fact, I have found 19 different books of the Bible have a prophecy about the sun going dark at the end of the age. I believe that this is literally talking about a change in the solar spectrum. The sun will still be putting out energy, but it will be doing so in the infrared, and it will appear black as sackcloth of ashes, as the Bible puts it, in the heavens. But the reflected light coming off the moon will be blood red, close to the infrared where the sun spectrum will be. So when that happens, obviously moisture in the atmosphere will begin to condense, and it will begin to turn, in other words, into water, and of course it will get colder and it will turn to ice. But it won't fall out of the sky until something disturbs the heavens. Meanwhile, we're told that the Antichrist and the kings of the world and the false prophet and the generals of the world, their soldiers, their armies, are all gathered together in a place called Armageddon. Now, Armageddon simply means the mountain of the gathering. So the place where they gather together and the mountain in front of which they gather, apparently to see somebody elevated above them. And I suspect that this is a ceremony of some kind, not a war, but a ceremony to crown the Antichrist, the King of the world, the Messiah, if you will, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, a title that does not belong to him. And so when this is occurring, at this moment, Christ returns from heaven, and as he does so, on a white horse, followed by his saints on white horses, he triggers with a shout of command and the voice of the great archangel, the trumpet sound, the loud noise, a loud vibration. He triggers all of this frozen moisture that's hovering overhead in the sky to begin to fall to the earth. And as it does so, it turns into, clumps into large hailstones, heavy as cannonballs, which then crush the heads of the Antichrist, the false prophet, and the generals and kings of the world who've gathered together to falsely declare him to be the Messiah, if you will. That event, in other words, is triggered by a vast throng of heavenly saints returning to the earth with Christ, who are disturbing the upper atmosphere. Notice that Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, that when Christ returns and he gives out this loud trumpet sound, the voice of the great archangel, the voice of a command, shout of a command, that he catches up the saints to meet him in the air when he comes. And then it says that, they're in the air, and so shall they ever be with the Lord. And then he goes, of course, to the Mount of Olives, according to prophecy. But before they get there, this hailstorm has to occur, because, you don't want to be on the earth when it occurs. So they stay up there until that storm has occurred. So it's clear that it is the shout of command of the returning Messiah with his heavenly host of saints who have been resurrected from the dead, and those who are alive and remain until his coming and are caught up to meet him in the air when he returns. They're all there in the air, in the atmosphere with him when the shout of command is going forth and the angels are gathering his elect from the four winds, the air, from the ends of the earth, as it says in Mark 13. So you just have a picture of all of this. What we're seeing right this minute with Comet Holmes, fulfilling a prophecy given to the family of Adam and Eve, what we're seeing right this minute in the heavens is a picture of the heavenly host, this comet which has exploded. In other words, this one person, Jesus, who has breathed his spirit into his whole body, into the body of Christ, as it were, sweeping through his lung area, over his heart, and down on top of the head of the Medusa, the head of Satan, the head of the false prophet and the Antichrist, all symbolized, the three Gorgons here in this one head symbolized, and is going to crush them on January 22nd. Now, remember, there are 4 3.5-year periods given in the book of Revelation. 3 of the 4 are, if you will, climaxing with this event. There is still a 4th 3.5-year period that is symbolically, if you will, to be anticipated. I think another object is going to appear in the heavens in a symbolic location, just like these others have. And it will do so 3.5 years after October of this year. In other words, just slightly under 3.5 years from now. And when that object shows up, it is going to set in motion the events of the last days. That will be, if you will, the final prophetic omen or warning in the sky that will begin this process, which will itself take several years to unfold. But the events that will be taking place on January 22nd of 2008 must be very significant. Something very significant obviously took place back on April 11th of 1997 when there was a fire in the Turin Chapel and somebody perhaps tried to steal some of the DNA of Jesus, perhaps to clone the Antichrist, for all we know. At least that seems to be something that they could have done if they had chosen to do so. Now, the comet was crossing the head of Satan, that is Rosh Hashanah, in the eye of the Medusa at that particular moment as that fire was raging. On January 22nd of 2008, very possibly, we will be deciding who is going to be the next president of the United States. The person who will be president 3.5 years from now. Who will that person be? Will it be a person like, for example, Governor Huckabee, who believes in Bible prophecy? Or will it be somebody like Hillary Clinton, who probably does not, though she might say so if she was in a church and looking for votes? Who will it be? Will it be a Mormon like Mitt Romney, who has a very different view of prophecy? Will it be somebody like Giuliani, who is sort of almost an agnostic Catholic? Who will it be? Obviously, whoever it is, there's going to be an object in the sky of great significance. And given the preparation here, I believe an object that will be a naked eye object, visible to the whole world, very dramatic, something that all these other objects have been anticipating. There are ancient prophecies outside of the Bible. The Hopi Indians, for example, have a prophecy about a blue star that is coming, and about a red star that is coming. They're called kachinas, which appears to be a word that symbolizes a comet to them. Now, it's interesting that kachina, literally, if it were a Hebrew phrase and not Hopi, could mean ha-kain ha, meaning the woman of Cain, or a female Cain, which is an interesting name, since Medusa is a feminine, not a masculine symbol. So you could argue that it had something to do with a comet that had something to do with the Medusa. But you know that Scorpio is considered a feminine sign. So technically, all 4 of these visible naked eye comets have been associated with a symbol connected to a feminine sign of evil. If we look in the book of Revelation, there is such a being. It is Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. A queen I sit, no husband have I. Interesting. Who could that be? Did you know that Cain had a woman, a wife? It's mentioned right there in Genesis 4. According to some of the ancient traditions, her name was Lulawa. But another way to say the same thing in Hebrew, which means an illuminated woman, is Lilith. And in fact, Lilith is said to be the wife of Halil. Halil means the shining one, also known as Lucifer, who is called the son of dawn, the son of Satan. And so Satan's son, again, another possible designation for Cain, is being designated here. We are looking at Satan's seed symbolically in all of these references, possibly even in the Hopi reference. And the Hopi say that this new age that's going to usher in a new sun which of course means the old sun has to go dark, they say that cheetahs, these red and blue stars or comets, are appearing in our skies right now. Well, that's about all we have time for. What I'm going to do here is give you my website again. You'll see some more information up there about these things. We also have some recordings about this that are on CD, and you'll see a link there as well on the home page if you want to pursue this further. You'll see more information related to it and to the planet Mars and what I expect to occur there. The website, once again, is TheTimeQuest.com. That's all one word, TheTimeQuest.com. This is Olaf Hage. Thank you for listening.